Hello again, friends. I'm making a series of videos based on Elton John's autobiography, Me. Now, I've already made two. This time I'm going to be looking at some of the issues raised in chapter 3 of the book. So if you're reading along, this may be of interest to you. Now, it's 1969 and Elton is working as a session musician, backing artists such as Tom Jones' Scaffold and perhaps most famously the Hollies. Now, I think I'm right in saying that he played on The Air That I Breathe. He played the piano on that track. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, one memory he has is that while playing as a session musician, Paul McCartney comes by, sits down at the piano and says, "Listen to what I've just written." And he goes on to play Hey Jude, in fact, an 8-minute version of the song. Imagine how Elton must have felt and been inspired by being present at this historic moment. Elton was also at the time working for a company called Marble Arch, who became famous for producing the Top of the Pops records. Now, if you have one of these, a bit like this one, you'll know they were famous certainly for having a politically incorrect cover, but also some cover versions of songs that were popular in the charts at that particular time. Now, the one I've got here has got tracks on it like Woodstock, Heaven Help Us All, which was a Stevie Wonder track, Crackling Rose, and Voodoo Child. So quite a variety of influences there and different tracks. But they were all produced and sang by the same artist. They just did different voices on it. And Elton really enjoyed this, being one artist one moment and another artist the next moment. In fact, he says in the book that one moment he had to be Robin Gibb from the Bee Gees, and the next moment he had to be a member of the England World Cup squad singing Back Home. So you get the impression around this time that Elton's career wasn't particularly going in the direction he wanted. But there's a significant moment here when he meets Steve Brown from DJM Records. Now, Steve Brown was quite excited by a song that Elton and Bernie written called Lady What's Tomorrow. Now, Elton says it was one of the songs we'd written that we hadn't even bothered to try and sell. But Steve Brown took a slightly different view of it. He said, "I'm going to talk to Dick James and see if we can make an album around this song." Now, another song they'd written around this time was Lady Samantha. Now, they were more interested in this one. Elton says it sounded completely different from I've Been Loving You, which we talked about in the previous video. He says it was weightier, hipper, and more confident. And this was released as a single in January of 1969. And he says it became a turntable hit. By what he means by that is that it got some radio play, but it wasn't necessarily a hit with the public in terms of buying the record. Now, that was on Philips. Philips didn't really want to continue the relationship. They didn't think that Elton was going to sell them a lot of records. I bet they regret that decision now. Now, one of the things Dick James asked Elton and Bernie to do was to write them a Eurovision Song Contest winning song. Now, lots of people have tried over the many decades to do this. So we come to the 1969 contest, and Elton and Bernie come up with a song, I Can't Go On Living Without You. Now, if you listen to the playlist I've created, you'll be able to hear that song. Now, what's interesting about it is that, in fact, Bernie was so opposed to the idea of entering the song contest that he didn't actually contribute to this song, according to Elton. Elton wrote the words and the music. Now, what happened at the time was that all 6 songs were to be sung by Lulu, and it would go out on TV. People would then send in their votes, and the winning song would go through. Now, unfortunately, Elton's song only got 5,000 votes, whereas Boom Banga Bang got 56,000 votes, so that was the one chosen. Now, it was an interesting contest because Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice also submitted a song called Try It and See. That didn't even make the final 6. Intriguingly, there's another song on the list called Are You Ready for Love? Presumably not the one written by Elton later on in his career, but isn't it interesting that that title came up at that time? So anyway, that's how Elton nearly got into the Eurovision Song Contest. So let's come to that first album, which came out in June 1969 on the DJM label called Empty Sky. And of course, this is it here. Now, I've reviewed the whole album in a previous video, which I will give a link to. Now, it wasn't a hit, but it did get some decent reviews. And it did have one or two songs that have kind of stayed in Elton's repertoire. Now, one of those songs, Lady Samantha, kind of sort of mysterious song, was picked up by another band called Three Dog Night. And I've got a version of that recording on my playlist as well, if you want to listen to it. And Elton concludes that we didn't sound like anyone else. And he also, at the time, thinks about how he's going to look on stage, and he wants to have an individual look. And his conclusion from that is that now we didn't look like anyone else either. So the whole idea of the Elton John band, the Elton John image, and the Elton John sound is all coming together as early as 1969. Now, Elton and Bernie were living at Frome Court. Bernie comes up with some lyrics over breakfast one morning, hands them to Elton, and in 15 minutes flat, Elton writes Your Song. So what we've got here is one of the greatest recordings of the 1970s, one of the greatest songs in modern popular music, is just knocked off in 15 minutes. So perhaps, these great ideas come together very quickly. They don't have to be worked on. And so that is the origins of that wonderful song. And it's great to have that in the autobiography here. Now, despite the modest sales of Empty Sky, Dick James says he wants another album from Elton. And he was going to give them £6,000 to make it, which is probably quite a lot of money in those days. Gus Dudgeon comes in as the producer. He produced David Bowie's Space Oddity, so some great credentials there to make creative music with Elton. And the arranger Paul Buckmaster comes in as well, who we know is so talented in creating these luscious orchestral soundscapes for Elton's compositions. You've probably guessed here we have the beginnings of the Elton John album, and Elton talks about songs such as I Need You to Turn To, a beautiful ballad, and in fact playing the harpsichord for virtually the first time, and sort of using that as an interesting instrument on the album. Of course, he'd used it on Skyline Pigeon, hadn't he? But maybe not many artists were using that at the time. Now, the reviews of the Elton John album were good, but it didn't get much airplay until it was taken up by a British DJ called John Peel. This was around April 1970. Now, if you're watching this from the United States or elsewhere in the world, you may not have heard of John Peel, but he was kind of a legendary figure in sort of pop and rock music, and was particularly known for the beginnings of Radio 1 in the UK, and for playing sort of bands that weren't well known in other circles. So he wasn't somebody who played sort of chart music necessarily. He was a kind of DJ who heard of a new band, heard of a new artist, and would give them airtime when perhaps no other presenters would do that. Another name we can think of is the great Bob Harris, of course, who is still presenting here in the UK. He was another great figure for finding new artists and giving them airtime. And a lot of bands and artists sort of owe their success almost to these key figures in British broadcasting. Anyway, Elton gets invited onto Top of the Pops. No longer pretending to be somebody else on the records, but actually being himself on the TV program. He plays Border Song. Now, I can't find that recording anywhere on YouTube, so I've put another version on my playlist of Elton singing Top of the Pops. This is in a BBC concert program, but again, it's nice footage, really sort of raw performance, great vocals and band performance. Now, Elton finishes this chapter by talking about his first visit to perform in America at the Troubadour Club. Now, this story is told very well in the Rocket Man film, and I put a link to the part of the film there which shows him performing at the Troubadour. Basically, from the book, he's suggesting he thought the whole thing was going to be a flop, But when he got there, they'd managed to create a lot of hype about his visit. He says they had miraculously turned a show by an unknown artist at a 300 capacity club into a real event, and it had a profound knock-on effect on me. So although it was a small venue, it had a great atmosphere, and it made Elton feel wanted and appreciated in the United States. And what's more, who should be sitting there in the front but Leon Russell, one of his great heroes? And of course, they renew that friendship much later on in the wonderful album, The Union. So that's a few thoughts about 1969 and 1970 in Elton's career. Let me know if you've got any comments on anything I've mentioned or anything you want to correct or add some information in. I'll be back with another video shortly looking at some of the themes that arise from chapter 4 of Elton John's autobiography. Thanks for watching. Don't forget, we're still standing.